Right. Well, that's certainly true here in the United States. In fact, the thing that distinguished us from every other country in the world up until the mid-'70s was one polling question: do you think next year will be better or worse? And up until the mid-1970s, Americans always said next year will be better. And now, not so true. So, Jane, what's happened here? And in terms of youth, getting young people into the market and getting them the skills that we need, because there are, I mean, you know, we are light 70,000 welders in this country. We need 70,000 welders, and our school system just can't seem to provide them.
Well, let me say a few things. First of all, when I arrived this morning, Joe told me he was sick and I shouldn't give him a hug. I gave him a hug anyway. There are very few people whose germs I will accept. And he's showing off now. I am a recovering politician. I'm trying to wash my hair and wash my brain out from where I have recently worked. That does not mean that there aren't many talented people in both political parties in the United States Congress now. I served there for 9 terms, 119 dog years. But the place has become dysfunctional. And the reason I tell you this little piece of history is because it is relevant to answering this question. Here is the private sector innovating. That's fabulous. Here is a government struggling to get to the right policies to employ its workforce, especially its young workforce. Here is the country in which you all are now, whether you are American or not, that has probably still the strongest economy in the world, surely the strongest military in the world, the most wealth in the world, and we are not leveraging the resources we have to fix this problem. And I guess I want to change the subject for a minute, but I think you'll approve of it, Joe. But I think the biggest failure of government policy in this country right at the moment, and there are plenty of failures, including this risk that our government may close in 4 days and that we may default on our debt. But right up there is our failure to enact comprehensive immigration reform. Because when you look at who the innovators are and who has created the wealth in this country and who the future entrepreneurs are, at least 25% or 50% are immigrants. And the graduates of Caltech, for example, 50% of the graduates of Caltech right now have to return to their countries, can't stay here even if they choose to, and most of them would choose to, and each one of those people immediately could establish 5 supportive jobs to whatever that person wants to do. Here's why I wanted to change the subject, because I'm assuming this is an international audience, and at least we all care about that. I want to know what we say to the kid in Yemen, in the boonies of Yemen, who's clearly unemployed and uneducated, and deciding right now whether to strap on a suicide vest. And I think we need a message, not just from the United States, but certainly from people, the immigrants or the kids of immigrants sitting here, to that kid, that is a message of hope. That if you don't do that, you will find a job in your country, you can join, you can become educated in the cloud, you can do something. And we don't have any answers for that, good answers yet. And until we get good answers for that, I think our world is going to be stuck in this paradigm of fear against these asymmetric terror attacks by people who don't really hate us, but who have been brainwashed in a system where just a few people hold all the juice. And it worries me terribly. And I think it relates specifically to this issue of where are the jobs.
Part of the answer to that problem, I think, is sitting in this room. He was certainly on an earlier panel. His name is Ron Bruder. Ron, are you out there somewhere? You want to stand? I don't see you. Anyway, Ron runs a program called Education for Employment in the Middle East. He's an American businessman. And he, after 9/11, he took a tour through the region to see what people wanted. And what they wanted was for their kids to have real skills. And that involved 2 things. It involved soft skills like looking your boss in the eye, shaking his or her hand, not screaming and running out of the building when you're criticized. And it also meant learning skills that actually are in need. In Jordan, air conditioning repair people, for example. I'm wondering, Carlos and Gabi, let's go back to you. The people who are taking advantage of your programs, I understand how technology can leverage learning. Where do they get the skills to deal with prospective employers? Where do they find out where the jobs are?
So I'll take a crack at it. So on the first question, it's not only technology training. You have to prepare people for work. There's a lot of soft skills on communications, on being able to interact and be able to write and do all the things that are required. So actually, as part of the program through gamification, we're actually teaching a lot of those soft skills. And in addition to that, there's communities being built in an electronic fashion, since they're all connected anyway, on how to share jobs and what to do. I just want to add one more comment, which I think is really pertinent to this dialogue. Is this is a really big problem. This is not an easy one to solve. And what I see with big problems is we get kind of stuck in trying to find a solution that's going to fix it. And the reality of it is no great idea ever started with the problem being known. If you think about it, everything starts with an experiment. You try something out, and very few ideas that are really, really big today, whether it's Google or something else, actually started doing what they set out to do. So one of the things we need to do here as a group is, how do we think about unleashing a lot of experiments and monitoring those experiments, learning from those experiments, and for each of us to kind of go about it and do it a little bit different. And if we did that, I think we could begin to arrive at the problem. So how do you take this big thing and make it much smaller?
And I also think technology can only be an enabler. It's not the solution in and by itself. That's why it's so important to work with these local partners. So we've just been to Tunisia to work with the education system there. I was in Saudi last week in order to bring our programs exactly to the folks. Same thing in the UAE. It is a mix between what we can bring that then gets basically implemented locally. And so you get this mix of offline and online. And one of the modules that we're teaching is exactly the 21st century skills. And it's also creating this mindset of the 21st century. People, our students understand that statistics say that 65% of those that are in high school today will end up in a job that doesn't even exist today. So they have to think and act like entrepreneurs, whether they work for HP or Cisco or whether they have their own shop. You need to invent yourself and reinvent yourself, and you need to constantly sort of take a look at, how can I take advantage of what's out there, specifically in information technology, to drive transformative change. And as I said earlier, a lot of the kids, at least in the more mature and Western markets, they use a lot of the information technology for a lot of entertainment and communications, but they don't drive transformative change. When we were just recently in Kenya, and you take a look at what the Kenyans have done on basic mobility to transform their society, it's unbelievable. So this mindset is going to be key to changing basically the attitude, because there's a lot of tools out there that kids could utilize in order to really, create a good future for themselves.
I've written about this subject and about education for at least 40 years now. Time sure flies when you're getting old. And in my experience, back in the 80s, there were two politicians who said to me, government is going to be the last major institution to enter the 21st century, and we have to do something about that. Those two politicians were the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, and a young Republican activist in the Congress named Newt Gingrich. And it seems to me that a lot of this innovation immediately faces roadblocks when it gets up against the education establishment. And so I'd like to ask Notis first, and then Jane. Notis, how has your ministry changed? How have you streamlined and made it easier for innovation to take place in Greek education and in the hiring of young people? And specifically, how have you dealt with your unions?
First of all, I'll say that I agree that the solution for this problem will come from the private sector. I come from the private sector. I'm not a traditional government person. I think that the government can only do a couple of things. One is policies, make the country more open for investments and trade in a national or international level, fund initiatives, and we're trying to fund, for example, now initiatives at a European level through the youth initiatives and the youth guarantee for young people to get the kind of skills that the market needs for them to go into jobs, and also subsidize job creation at difficult times in a counter-cyclical policy to the extent that fiscal environment allows you to do so. We will be slower from the private sector, I admit that. But we are taking the policies, for example, the area of education, trying to link more education with apprenticeships. And I think that's a critical change in the Greek educational system. We are trying to bring the private sector closer through this dual system with the universities. At the same time, we encourage people to attain education not only in the public sector. I mean, there's a very dynamic private sector of education in Greece and throughout Europe, and Greek students have always been very open in traveling around the world and get the skills, and they then come back to the country. And that has created a very well-educated workforce, which gives us hope that we can get through the crisis. One thing we all need to be aware of is that there is a risk throughout Europe of a lost generation, and this lost generation is a big challenge to our democratic values. You see what's happening politically in a number of European countries where you have non-mainstream political forces coming through, the kind of forces we are trying to avoid in democracy as a reaction to this huge unemployment. So I think in a European level and in a global level, we need to invest more to ensure that we don't have a lost generation.
I don't think it's just a question of government investment and government policy. Joe raises the issue of unions. Some unions are highly creative and helpful in the education space, and some are absolutely not. Mm-hmm. And the innovation that's happened in American education, by and large, in the last 2 decades, at least in my observation, some of it has come because of people standing up to education unions. Some of them have adapted, that's a good thing. Some of them have not, and they have found their enrollment decreasing substantially because parents insist and societies insist that kids get better education and have better teachers. And the oldest teachers don't necessarily deserve protection if they're not the best teachers, mm-hmm. et cetera. So some of this has been dragging the unions into the future, but part of it, as everyone has said here, has had to rely on private sector innovation. 2 new tools that matter, and they were described here. One is creating technology tools beyond the classroom through the internet to educate kids. And there are all these experiments now with lots of teachers that we know, in fact, they're now our generation, who are teaching millions of people through these online exercises all around the world. So that's kind of one thing that's happening that I think is very interesting. The other thing is games. One of you mentioned it, Carlos mentioned it. At the Wilson Center, we have a science, we're the only think tank, do tank, that has a science and technology program that is using games to teach people, for example, about the budget. We have a game called Budget Hero that has been played 1.5 million times, and everyone says, and I agree, of course I'm totally objective, that it is the best tool ever to teach people about everything that's in the US budget, US federal budget, and how hard it is to make the cuts and trades necessary to bring it into balance over a 10-year period. It's a complicated game. You play your values, so it's not just a simple exercise. But people love it and play it at all ages and in both political parties. We're going to do a game now on energy, which will show you what trades need to be made for energy independence in parts of the world, clean energy versus dirty energy, et cetera, conservation. But my point is, teaching this way is also hugely useful. And these kinds of tools do not depend on state-run education systems. I think that's where the future is. And just one last thing. I mean, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich have 2 of the most creative minds that have ever been in politics. They're not in politics anymore.
Right.
They're in platforms where I would guess, if you asked Bill Clinton, I think he feels more productive now as the head of the Clinton Global Initiative and this world citizen than he did as President of the United States.